Hello and welcome to our Christian Literary Imagination series. Today is the second event in the second year of this series, which is a Georgetown University Humanities Initiative in association with the Las Casas Institute at Blackfriars Hall and with Campion Hall, both at the University of Oxford. And today I'll be welcoming Professor John Hirsch, who will be talking about Geoffrey Chaucer with particular reference to the Man of Law's Introduction and Tale and the Clerk's Tale. After his talk, I will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience. We encourage you to participate by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. You can do so by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please do ask them, and we will endeavour to ask them ourselves to John towards the end of the event, or we will ask him to send you answers via email. Now, let me go and say something a little bit about Professor John Hirsch. He's a well-known scholar, well-known not just at Georgetown, also at Campion Hall in Oxford, where he often spends his summers in research. He's a distinguished medievalist, but has a specialism also in American literature of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. He is the author of many books and is a dedicated teacher who has an interest also in teaching children who are at risk. He is a good friend and he's a great scholar, and I'm delighted that he's with us today. So over to you, John.
Today, I'm going to talk about Geoffrey Chaucer. Indisputably, except perhaps for students of William Langland, the greatest English poet of the 14th century, and in particular about his understanding, or at least his representation, of what I am going to boldly call the nature of God. From everything we know about Chaucer, which thanks to scholars is actually quite a lot, more than we know about Shakespeare, for example, it is unlikely that he himself would have used that phrase even in private conversation, still less in public discourse. I should probably begin by admitting that Chaucer's reputation now, as in the past, is as a courtly, not a religious poet. Though thanks to Marion Turner's brilliant new biography, we must now acknowledge his European and not only his English connections. But whatever his reach, much of his poetry is indisputably courtly, though during the 19th and early 20th century, it seemed important to many scholars to dissociate him from the age in which he lived, filled as it was with Latinless, ignorant, and, it was believed, often corrupt priests who seemed to them to populate the pages of the Canterbury Tales, and whose putatively real-life counterparts were lovingly identified and vigorously attacked by the indefatigable G.G. Coulton. If rescued from his time, after all, Chaucer could be represented as the great English exception, even as a kind of proto-Protestant who saw through the effectively exposed the evident corruption that was in those dark days everywhere about him. Since then, other perspectives have emerged, and recently attempts have been made to develop an understanding of Chaucer's philosophical and religious attitudes, and to consider how far they may be reflected in his writing. The first opening may have come as an earlier generation of scholars saw the evident importance of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in The Knight's Tale and elsewhere, an influence reconsidered in 2004 in Mark Miller's markedly perceptive study, Philosophical Chaucer, which argues that the Canterbury Tales represent an extended and philosophical consideration of agency, autonomy, and reason. Until recently, Boethius's own Christianity was, and for some still is, somewhat in doubt, and it was not difficult for those who prefer a courtly to a religious poet to see his influence as effectively literary rather than philosophical. But in 1962, D.W. Robertson of Princeton University published his seminal, if highly controversial, Preface to Chaucer, a work which, as a student of mine once remarked, certainly threw a cat and the dog show and made everyone choose sides. Robertson's formulations between caritas and cupidity, for example, an absolute distinction that he subsequently disavowed, were set against a background of allegorical exegesis and analysis that had its roots in Augustine and that brooked no dissent. Here I should probably confess that my own patience with Robertsonianism is short, and I cite it largely to acknowledge its part in reopening interest in our poet's theological and philosophical inclinations, not with the putative content of those inclinations, and to contrast it with a non-allegorical, less ideological analysis to which I now turn. The Tales of Canterbury, as Chaucer calls them, are replete with religious allusions of many kinds, from the names of saints, invariably chosen with marked care and often pointed, often ironic effect, to the genres or the mix of genres represented, or to the casual religious, sometimes devout allusions that run throughout. In fact, there are few tales in which such reference do not figure, from the wife of Bath's instance that true nobility comes from Christ, to the utterly secular physician's anti-philosophical injunction that no one knows where God will strike next. But it is the judgment of many, and also of a collection of essays edited in 1990 by David Benson and Elizabeth Robertson, that there are in fact only 4 tales in the collection that can be unquestionably designated as religious: those of the man of law, the clerk, the prioress, and the second nun. No doubt that judgment, like most of the ones I'm going to offer today, can be contested, but I am going to abide by it for now, if only to move ahead thriftily, as Harry Bailey would say, and to focus on 2 of these putatively religious tales, in particular, those of the man of law and the clerk, leaving aside those of the prioress and the second nun, which, strictly speaking, seem to me concerned rather with the nature of faith than with the nature of God. And in many ways, the 2 tales now of interest are not dissimilar, since both engage the noble and guiltless suffering of an entirely innocent woman, among other things. Constance in the man of law's tale sets forth on a series of adventure that seem at once repetitious, implausible, and apparently without pattern. Griselda in the clerk's tale practices the unremitting obedience of a peasant to a halfway allegorical marquis, manifesting patience and endurance that are well beyond human capacity, as the university-educated clerk reminds us at the end of his tale. Much of the attention that both these tales have received has been to identify the motivation and behavior of the protagonists, sometimes in a Boethian or Augustinian context. The direction I wish to turn to, however, is to one that resonates with a Chaucerian near contemporary, namely John Duns Scotus, the Franciscan. It is perhaps an indication of his celebrity, if not his genius, that Scotus's name is still known today, though not widely familiar. And I can offer only the briefest introduction to the man and his work. John Duns Scotus's birth date, like that of Geoffrey Chaucer's, is unknown, but it may have been late in 1265 or early in 1266, since it is recorded that he was ordained to the Franciscan priesthood at St. Andrew's Priory in Northampton on the 7th of March, 1291. It is believed that his subsequent studies at Oxford ended by 1301, after which he moved to Paris, from which he was expelled in June 1303, probably for having taken the Pope's part against King Philip the Fair in a conflict concerning church property. He returned to Oxford, and where he remained until April 1304, when, like others who had been expelled, he was allowed to return to France. And in November of that year, he was appointed Regent Master of Theology for the Franciscans in Paris, a post he held until becoming lector in the Franciscan Studium in Cologne in October 1307. It was in Cologne that he died in 1308, traditionally on November 8th, and where he is buried today. Both in his lifetime and for centuries thereafter, Scotus's brilliance was universally acknowledged. And as I have said, he is still recognized today as one of the most important Northern European philosophers of the later Middle Ages, widely known in the schools through the development of humanism, challenged and reduced, though his reputation in universities, particularly in Italy, became in the 16th century. But he certainly rethought and rearticulated many of the propositions present in earlier scholastic teaching with great acuity. And today I'm going to direct attention to one of these, namely his consideration of God's nature, a proposition that any Oxford clerk contemporary with Chaucer would have understood. The circumstances of this talk make it necessary for me to curtail discussion of the extraordinary range of Scotus's thinking, and even to limit what I myself have to say about this one. I should, however, with apologies, refer you to a recent article by me in the January 2021 issue of Modern Language Review, which concerns precisely this matter. Its focus is largely literary rather than philosophical. That is, any claim in it to originality pertains to Chaucer, not to Scotus, but it may be at least somewhat useful to philosophers who take an interest in literature, and also to the rather smaller number of students of literature who sometimes look to philosophy. In what follows, I'm going to consider favorably the proposition that Chaucer's description of God's action in both tales is indebted to his understanding of the way God's agency is represented in Scotus, and in particular to its evident limitlessness and absolute freedom of his will. This voluntarist teaching seems to me both to constitute and to respond to philosophical inquiry, and to show the poet's coming to terms with God's apparent or even his evident nature, though of course Chaucer is also indebted to his narrative sources. I'm also going to refer at the end of this lecture, more or less in passing, to the challenges involved in associating literary accomplishment with philosophical inquiry, and particularly with identifying the source of Chaucer's access to Scotus. But what seems to me apparent from the image of God that appears in each tale is that the image Chaucer evokes in each one is of a powerful, even a ruthless divinity, whose actions, good by definition, are equally unpredictable, yet somehow reach out to a catalog of unimaginable human woes present in both tales. The Man of Law's tale is a wondrous thing, a mixture of saint's life, semi-chronicle, and a tale of almost Eastern wonder, which traces the passages and peregrinations, tests and physical come spiritual challenges of a Western woman who is both saint and queen, and who is driven about the known world from Syria to Northumberland to Rome, acting ever and deliberately in obedience to God's unremitting will, confronting challenges of such a magnitude that our author actually apologizes for them, all the while emphasizing the absolute and unremitting danger that is being imposed upon her, evidently by God's will. Throughout, the narrator movingly records sympathy for the suffering involved in being a human, alluding in the prologue to Pope Innocent III's 13th century treatise on the misfortunes of poverty, the De Misera Conditione Humanae, advancing easily from it to the equally horrific circumstances of the tale, also observed and at least permitted by God. Throughout, Constance, the heroine, devoutly accepts the painful semi-realities that God has sent her. Gottes Sonde, the text says often, or what God list, or even a sympathetic hand to strike down Constance's accuser. The list is long. Traditionally, these actions and interventions have been read as Boethian manifestations of God providence, though the focus of the tale is more upon the powerful and willful, especially willful actions of a God who is as inscrutable to human understanding as is the heroine's devout acquiescence. The image of a powerful, willful God, responsible only to his own dictates, is advanced even further in what I am calling the second of Chaucer's religious tales, that which the clerk, an advanced student of philosophy at Oxford, whose access both to the tale's source in Petrarch and to Scotus will not surprise us. The tale concerns the action of a particularly despicable marquis, one Walter of Suluso, who at his people's insistence agrees to take a wife and all on his own chooses Griselda, daughter of an old and poor peasant, whose fidelity he tests throughout the most of the narrative. As Chaucer in his own voice admonishes us at the end, the tale is not to be read literally, since it has such an evident symbolic dimension as well. As well as a literal one in which Griselda's patience with Walter, including his apparent murder of her children, indicates a Christian acceptance of what also appeared in the Man of Law's tale, namely the will of God. What is of further interest in the clerk's tale, however, is the extent to which Chaucer has gone to make Walter's imposition on his wife even worse, by which I mean even more demanding, more astringent, and even less humane than they are in his source in Petrarch. This insight, really quite extraordinary, given the degree of violence already present in Petrarch, is an evident hardening that was established early in the examination of Chaucer's sources, though its signal importance was not then understood. But without pronouncing the whole tale allegorical, there are counter and empirical indications throughout. I suggest that there is little doubt that Walter's extraordinarily testing impositions stand for those that the Christian, like everybody, encounters in life, and their reputation here is to inquire into the nature of a God who would permit them. Such circumstances are alluded to repeatedly, and the changes having been made exist in both tales. But again, they seem to me to resonate less with Boethius than with Scotus, evidently, if imperfectly, but evidently all the same. Thus, the wonderful miracle God shows of Griselda is known to clerks, though full dark to men's wit, to men's mind. In the Man of Law's tale too, references to Jonah's deliverance, to Judith's killing of Holofernes, stands as proof that Constance's miraculous preservation while on the sea without food and drink in a rudderless boat, I remind you, is not only credible, but further evidence of God's evident volition, which is not limited by human expectation or by nature itself. Indeed, the more unlikely the circumstance of deliverance, really in both tales, the more evident appears the nature of divine volition and the evidence for divine intervention. I've used the word resonance to describe Chaucer's reference or allusion to Scotian thought, which I did partly to sidestep the issue of Chaucer's specific Scotian sources, since although Scotus was certainly a familiar of the university, Chaucer was not. Indeed, it is most doubtful that Chaucer attended university at all, and the question might reasonably be raised as to how then and to what depth did Chaucer understand his great, if not distant, predecessor. The teachings of Scotus that seems to me to resonate in Chaucer are, as I have been suggesting, those concerning God's knowledge and agency, and I should stress that what they do is to resonate. They are not articulated specifically or formally developed. But the circumstances that obtain in this case exist elsewhere as well, particularly when philosophical propositions appear in literary contexts. Still, the God who appears in the two fictions that concern me here is immensely powerful, hardly intelligible to those who worship him, and not bounded by human expectations, even as he manifests his protective agency, which is, of course, a very different thing from providence. The Scotian or perhaps semi-Scotian divinity who appears in Chaucer's texts is far more compatible with a world in which refugees like Constance are scattered by the winds in the Mediterranean, and in which women remain attached to their husbands and their God, in spite of the most extraordinary instances of physical attack, circumstances that obtain at least as often in the 21st century as they did in the 14th. In context, then, such reflection as Scotus holds out for refugees from war and persecution, like those who are still drowned in the Mediterranean and in the Rio Grande, makes it possible to address, if not to account for, the disconnected universe we share with them, one in which God and humankind reach out to each other, and in which mortals live in hope and doubt, fear and dependence, depending upon the circumstances, a certain sense of certitude as well. I misread that last sentence. I'm going to read it one more time. I apologize for that. So the last two sentences, actually. It goes something like this. The Scotian or perhaps semi-Scotian divinity who appears in Chaucer's texts is far more compatible with a world in which refugees like Constance are scattered by the winds in the Mediterranean, and in which women remain attached to their husbands and their God, in spite of the most extraordinary instances of physical attack, circumstances that obtain at least as often in the 21st century as they did in the 14th. In context, then, such reflection as Scotus holds out for refugees from war and persecution, like those who are still today drowned in the Mediterranean and in the Rio Grande, makes it possible to address, and makes it possible for us to address, if not to account for, the disconnected universe we share with them, one in which God and humankind reach out to each other, in which mortals live in hope and doubt, fear, and, depending upon the circumstances, a limited sense of certainty as well. The fabulous events that are virtually hallmarks of the two tales I've been concerned with, events that are so often passed over in silence, are resounding, if complex, signs of divine presence, and as such lend gravity to both the narratives, even as they also lend meaning to the apparently easy endings that both tales allow. In the article that I have already mentioned, I sought to answer, or at least to respond to, the question concerning Chaucer's source of Scotus's teaching, or at least as many of them as he had some knowledge of, which I did by citing Chaucer's friendship with one Ralph Strode, a former student and teacher of philosophy in Merton College, Oxford, and subsequently a colleague and a friend of Chaucer's in London. But I'm told by an avalanche of oaths in favor of brevity from our excellent moderator that I have not time to develop that argument here, except to say that if you read my article, I'm sure you will find the argument there convincing. At least that's what it says here, perhaps not. I should probably confess, as I did there, as I did not there, that my argument turns in part upon my own belief that Geoffrey Chaucer was among the most perceptive and actively curious of English poets. It would not have failed to take an interest of what was happening in the schools, teachings to which Ralph Strode could have offered him a convenient opening. I have not, of course, been able to complete my argument here, though to the extent to which Chaucer did write in even halfway philosophical fictions, I suggest that he did so with evident religious interests, though in the pre-Cartesian tradition of faith-seeking understanding. In this context, there are two related points which have informed this lecture. The first is to acknowledge my indebtedness to many academic philosophers, too many to really to name here. And though in general terms, I suppose Richard Cross has become, for me at least, primus inter pares, none of them is responsible for the use I have made of his or her text while I have been seeking to approach what Robert Pippin and perhaps our own Terry Pinkert might call philosophy by other means. But even when that has been said, what I have been aiming at as well is to treat philosophical argument not simply as another literary influence, as has been done traditionally with Boethius and Mutatis Mutandis Augustine, but as a kind of co-respondent to a moment in time that appears to have engaged poet and philosopher alike, finally granting neither one precedence, but insofar as it is possible to do so, allowing each to benefit not only from the method and the practice, but also from the understanding of the other. I, of course, agree that except unaided, I must not try my arm too far. Except, as it were, in the shower, I am neither a philosopher nor a singer of opera, and have sought to acknowledge that limitation. But what engaged Chaucer in his two most evidently religious fictions, I suggest, is a concern for the nature of God as it is manifested in a universe that often seems quite inhospitable to humankind, not the more limited concern representing any one pilgrim's sort of understanding of it. Implicit in what I have been saying is an unspoken tribute not only to Chaucer's evident religiousness and his interest, however acquired in serious philosophical inquiry, but also to his inquisitive habit of mind, an intellectual curiosity for which, and in spite of countless studies on the almost bewildering number of sources to which he alludes, he has not been given sufficient credit. I've said elsewhere that I do not believe that Chaucer was a Scotian in any meaningful sense of that term, though I believe that it is evident enough that he was seriously attached to Scotus's understanding of the ways in which God's willing, indeed willful, intervention in human affairs is made manifest, and how far these interventions might be understood by humankind. As such, I'm inclined to consider Chaucer as a far more serious, even a far more intellectual and philosophical poet than his reputation now is. Though his thinking about such matters was not invariably systematic and was informed by an evident spirituality that, thank goodness, I'm not going to be able to discuss today. In the end, however, I warmly recommend him and his text to everyone, but particularly to anyone who has not read him recently, and I do so in the strongest possible terms, not only for his evident philosophical sentence, but also for his engaging and usually secular solace. The end. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John, for a very interesting lecture. And raising these issues about his philosophical comprehension, if not being fully developed Scotian, but that it's very interesting because you can find that people will read these tales in particular and I see a kind of a superficial archetype to them. But I'll come back to that in a moment, because there's a very interesting question coming from Shannon Mulligan, who says, thank you very much for this wonderful talk, Professor. My question asks you, Professor Hirsch, to regard the religious journeys of Constance and Griselda. Did Chaucer intend for each to represent a predominant theme that might invigorate the sum of the parts, as with the Second Nun's Tale and the Prioress's Tale? Was this an intentional quadrupling, or simply because of an unfinished larger work?
Sorry, just Michael, can you repeat the key moment in that sentence where she says,
my question asks you to regard the religious journeys of Constance and Griselda.
Right.
Did Chaucer intend for each to represent a predominant theme that might invigorate the sum of the parts, viz., with Second Nun's Tale and the Prioress's Tale? Was this an intentional quadrupling, or simply because of an unfinished larger work?
No, I think it's extremely interesting and good question. I myself am inclined to regard the four tales, if we're agreed that those are the four clearly religious tales, as differing in some ways. The God that emerges in the two tales that I've been discussing seems to me to be, in a way, an important aspect of the tales that is not usually engaged, or if it is engaged, they're read in Boethian themes. As I said towards the beginning, the tales told by two women, very important, and I think very closely related to each other, are concerned more with faith, the faith of the Orthodox Christian, which I believe Chaucer was. Though he was also a questioning Christian and engaging, and one who was very much engaged with the deformities that he saw about him as well. But I'm inclined to sort of I'm inclined to make a distinction between those four tales, though it's certainly right that the tales do bear a kind of connection in terms that that all human life as perceived by Christian commentators tends to be a kind of voyage, often read as a pilgrimage. Indeed, the whole of the Canterbury Tales is a pilgrimage. And when you read the Canterbury Tales as a pilgrimage, it assumes a kind of religious dimension, which was more apparent in the 14th century than in the 21st. So from that point of view, yeah, I see the point. And I think it's as I say, I think it's a perceptive question. It seems to me to be leading on to a slightly different argument than the one that I was making this afternoon, though.
Thank you for that. Julia Lamb, it's lovely to hear from you, Julia. Julia's going to be giving a talk to us later on in the series on Julian of Norwich. And she says this: "Thank you, John. This is fascinating. Is it that the Scotian view of God helped him make sense of the times, its violence, fragmentation, scatteredness? And how much do you see an argument of science of divine presence that you mention at the end? In other words, is it just reflecting the times, or also providing a kind of antidote, a flicker of hope in divine presence, despite the evidence of seeming absence and arbitrariness?"
Yeah, so thank you. Again, an extremely good and perceptive question. And my answer to it largely is yes. I mean, I think that is very much what Chaucer is doing. And I think that's why we need a Scotian reading of Chaucer, as well as a Boethian one, as well as changes having been made in Augustinian one, if we're going to really understand the role of philosophy in his work. Just partly to clarify this, I very much like the idea of a philosophical Chaucer, a philosophical in a way that I think he's not often read. I suppose, to put it this way, I would like a slightly more Miltonic, a slightly less Shakespearean Chaucer to come upon us. And I think one way that we do that is by looking at the philosophical insights. But the question that Julia Lamb's question begins with is absolutely right. I think when he looked at things that were happening around him, he looked at, refugees were a huge problem in the 14th century, just as they are with us today. And he understood that this posed not only economic questions, but for heaven's sake, it posed theological, it posed religious questions as well. And the religious questions that it posed was, how do we countenance this with the nature, how do we describe the God who will allow this to proceed? And the Boethian God can't really do that. And depending on how you read the Augustinian gods, Lord knows what it can provide. But in some ways, the Scotian God does. And especially when you take into effect God's will, his volition, as well as a keen understanding of his absolute power, of his potentia absoluta, then it becomes possible to confront the kind of madness that goes on in these tales. And I say madness because, of course, we have to remember that Chaucer goes out of his way to emphasize, which he carries over from his source, to be sure. And his source, it's read very much as in hagiographical terms. But when Chaucer carries over his source, for example, the fact that the heroine is put in a boat in Syria and emerges from the boat in Northumberland, in the north of England, having traveled that whole distance in a boat that is not only rudderless, but without food or drink. And Chaucer takes this seriously, as he would have done in the 14th century. And it's that kind of analysis that points us directly towards his consideration, a serious consideration of who this God is that appears in both of these tales. Stop. End.
Okay, thanks for that. Cecilia Hatt from Oxford, lovely to hear from you, Cecilia. Hope you're well. She says this. It's quite a long question. This might it not be the case that Chaucer's depiction of the shocking treatment of Constance and Griselda is intended to evoke indignation at the injustice inflicted by cruel men? His accounts of their deliverance don't suggest an answer to prayer so much as a half eschatological, desirable state for the wronged woman, and half an acknowledgement that the literary form demands a happy ending.
Excellent. Again, good question. Listen, sorry, wait, I've got something that's come out of my screen. I have to get rid of it. Yeah. One thing that let's come back. Right. One thing that I think is absolutely clear in Chaucer is that, to use a modern term that was not available to Chaucer, is that Chaucer was, and he was seen as, a feminist. And I think the degree of his investment in feminism is just unmistakable. And it's unmistakable in these two tales. And if the definition of feminism is, at least in part, that their treatment by evil, dreadful, unspeakable men is part of the analysis, yes, I certainly agree with that. But the complication, I think, for me at least, is that Chaucer's feminism is conditioned by his religiousness. I think when we talk about Chaucer's feminism, as is often and rightly done, in my opinion, it has to be done as well in the Christian context in which he frames it. I think it's fairly clear, sort of in these two tales. And Chaucer is no atheist; he's no agnostic. He's very much a believing, and in some respects, an Orthodox Christian. Though, as I say, he very, very strongly is willing to interrogate the nature of the God that he sees at work in the universe. And that God is not a Boethian God. Boethian gods were a little bit too simple for him. But when he looks at what happens with Constance and with the other refugees that were present in the 14th, and now, of course, very powerfully in the 21st century, and when he poses the question as to the nature of a God who will allow and permit such things to happen, he rejects a too simple an analysis of what God was. Scotus was, of course, a Franciscan priest. He was Orthodox in his way, but he was a philosopher, and he was much engaged in asking, I think, in some ways, the same kind of serious questions that anybody who is a theist today must ask when they confront so much that is dreadful, that is going on in the universe. And I think it's that sense that causes him to turn, as he does, to the nature of God. But I don't see what I've been discussing as separate from his feminism. It's a part of it. Chaucer's feminism and his theology are married. And he was, as I say, I mean, I think you have to accept that Chaucer was a Christian. He was indeed a believing Christian in his day. And therefore, to interrogate his feminism, it becomes necessary to interrogate his religiousness as well, or if not his personal religiousness, then the intellectual nature of his religiousness, that is his philosophy. And so, I mean, I take the very good point that the questioner raises, but I suggest that it's not different from the point that I'm raising. It's an extension of it. I didn't go into the question of gender, the question of Chaucer's feminism and what I did, but what I did say, that is the nature of the philosophical inquiry that Chaucer makes, is intimately related to the question of Chaucer's, to me, evident feminism.
Could I just take that a little bit further, John? In the Clerk's Tale, or the Clerk's Tale, depending which side of the pond we're on.
Yes.
There's an interesting moment when Chaucer implies that while someone from a poor background, non-wealthy, meaning poor, could accept the treatment of Griselda by Walter, a woman from a rich background might not.
Yeah.
Now, does this help us understand any more his authorial intentions with the?
That's a nice point. It really is. I actually think it takes us in another very interesting direction, which is again Chaucer's religiousness, as I say, is inseparable from his feminism, but it's also inseparable from his complex political beliefs, which were not ours entirely, but were in part. I don't want to get off into that today, if you'll forgive me. But one thing that's obvious about these two tales is that for all their similarities, one of the big differences is the class of the two women who are involved. The one is a queen and the other is a peasant. And in fact, in making that contrast, which I think Chaucer did consciously, was that this was his way of not, if you like, attaching his understanding of God, which, as I say, is clearly indebted, seems to me, clearly indebted to Scotus, to one or to the other. It appears in both. And the point that you're making seems to me a good one, which is that there are two very different classes that are involved in these two different tales is important. But again, what the tales do show as well is that the nature of God does not change according to the class of the person, man or woman, with whom he is concerned.
Let's just take that a little bit further, because I think that's a great answer. But there's something else which is to do with sources as well, because there's a philosophical. What you're implying is that there's some kind of philosophical source, but of course there's a narrative source as well to these tales. And Catherine asks, she said, I'd be very interested in hearing John's talk about how source research, such as this one you've had, has led you into interesting directions. And I'd like to just add a little bit more to that and say, in different directions, but the directions have got to have some kind of parallel with them, have they not?
Yeah, if you're talking about sources, I think that's very much the school in which I was raised and from which I had at least partly departed. But the source that I mentioned particularly here, without really going into it, when we were talking about Griselda, we talked about Petrarch. And specifically what I referred to there, which I think may be in Dr. Pasternak's suggestion, was the person of Walter in Griselda's tale. And the issue there is an interesting one, because that's been very closely studied by a professor called J. Burke Sievers, initially in a book that was published out of Yale in 1942, many years ago. And I just mentioned that because what that book did was to describe absolutely the differences between the Petrarch that Chaucer read and the Petrarch that he produced in his tale. And one thing that it's primarily concerned with was the differences in somebody like Walter. And as I think I may have mentioned in the tale, Walter emerges in Chaucer's tale as even worse than he was in Petrarch. Now, in that early tradition that I'm speaking of, the Sievers tradition, Sievers, great scholar though he was, he did not inquire into the reasons for that change. For him, once he had talked about artistic intention, that was what explained it to him. And basically what I guess I was trying to do with this is to take up, well, sources in both tales, but let's take that one as an example, and to say, yes, it's really important to understand what that earlier tradition of Chaucer scholarship did, which was to understand and to point to the differences, the departures that Chaucer made, which he does in all of his tales. He does it regularly, but then to ask the question as to why does he make that tale? Why does he make that that new departure that he does? And in this case, I think it was very much because he was alert to, he was alive to the realities of the world that his heroines were confronting, and that he was also alive to the fact that he and virtually all of his audience considered them to be living in a world in which there was an active God present, and he asked how this could be. That's where Scotus comes in. That's to answer what I think is Lee's question. The question as to how this new tradition comes into being, in spite of the fact that Chaucer is drawing on, and in some cases drawing very closely on, a sort of a known source. Sorry, Michael, did that come through? Or
that's right. Yeah, that's fine.
It says, see, the question with Chaucerian sources is even more lively than with Shakespearean sources. We all know that Shakespeare, and you especially, can jump free of his sources or use them or not, as he prefers. But Chaucer, in some cases, when he treats Petrarch, he follows that tale extraordinarily close, except when he doesn't. And that's when he doesn't is when it gets interesting.
Very good. Well, as you mentioned Shakespeare, of course, and sources that as you go through these tales, you think of some of Shakespeare's plays. You know, you think of maybe Measure for Measure, and the way that has been reviewed and criticised over the years, or indeed The Winter's Tale. Do you think that those are Chaucerian or Scotian in any way?
No. I think this is where I am going to sort of say, I think Shakespeare, you're the expert, Michael, not me, but my reading of Shakespeare is that he can depart easily into a secular universe and not worry about the more religious questions that come with Chaucer. And that when it's not that Chaucer cannot be secular, he certainly can and does, but he doesn't do it as easily as your friend Shakespeare does. And that the tales that you mentioned seem to me to proceed very ably, but without any necessary theological implication coming with them as well. Which with Chaucer, I think the philosophical implication, if not the theological ones, sometimes does come along as well. And it does partly because of the intellectual and philosophical traditions to which he's alert.
I understand what you say. Of course, if we were talking well, 70 odd, well, more than that years ago, with Wilson Knight, for example, talking about Measure for Measure, there is this kind of feeling that this is a divinity, that there's Angelo is going to reap his right rewards at the end, although maybe have mercy. You know, it's these kind of issues going on. But let's not get.
Oh no, I think that's a really good point. I think that's a very good point that you just made, and I think it's the real one. I think this is yeah. I had a friend who was, by the way, a student of G. Wilson Knight, and was much taken by a wonderful man called Yusef Rodriguez, who taught in our department for a number of years. But I think that the point is well taken. But the theology that emerges from in Knight's reading is very different than anything that could pop up in Chaucer, don't you think? Or do you? I mean, how far do you read Shakespeare as a philosophical or a theological author?
Well, the kind of criticism from over the last 20 or 30 years, of course, has been saying that we actually impose our own ideologies onto the interpretations. So
yes, I understand. Yes, I understand.
Yes, which can lead actually to critical chaos, I think. But I've written about that elsewhere recently. But I'd come back though.
Go ahead. Sorry.
to Chaucer and a criticism or an evaluation that says that Chaucer's works are fundamentally metonymic, i.e. a sideways method of associating ideas rather than metaphoric, which compacts ideas together.
Yeah.
Do you think that is the case?
It's an interesting distinction. It's not the one I've been interested in this afternoon or this evening, is whether it's there. And that, I mean, I think the way I've been reading, seeking to read his understanding of Scotius, which I think it very much is an understanding. It's not Scotius pure and simple, but I think it's a reflective reading of him, and I think he knows that. I think from Chaucer's point of view, what he's doing is he's interrogating Scotius to make Scotius of use to him. Just the way sometimes there are some philosophers. I mentioned Robert Pippin, for example, as a good modern philosopher who reads literature, reads it very perceptively, I think, but he interrogates it perhaps in such a way as to be useful to a philosopher. And as I say, I think Chaucer kind of does the reverse with that, sort of with that. So yes, I guess I'm not happy with that distinction, at least not as I've been talking about it this afternoon.
No, I understand that. Let's just take one more, which is there's this theory that Griselda is both a flat emblem of undeviating Christian obedience to the Creator, and Chaucer's decision to side with her emotionally as a woman tormented by the willful sadism of her husband, Walter. I think this is onto the narrative side of it, that he's writing a narrative story that, and within it, as you're arguing, there's a philosophical influence, but he's still got to get the narration, which gives him an emotional sympathy with her.
Yes, I see where you're coming from on this. I think I tend to read Chaucer's characters in somewhat less romantic terms. I remember decades ago now, having at least some of what I thought about Chaucer's characterization come clear to me when I was reading a book by Jill Mann on the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, and it's a book to which I still send students. Indeed, I sent one there 2 weeks ago. But at the same time, I think the difficulty with that particular reading is that it leads us off into too modern a representation of characterization, even though I do agree that there is an intellectual and perhaps also an emotional sympathy that Chaucer can manifest with indeed with many of his characters, both pilgrims and characters within the tales as well. But I think it never becomes quite so. The attachment never becomes quite so lively as to disguise the fact that they are also representatives of things other than themselves.
Yeah, that again links in with the way that Shakespearean criticism has gone on the overemphasis on maybe on characterization after the Romantic period and a kind of the backlash at the end of the 20th century towards that. Very interesting kind of parallels there of reading historical pieces of work, historical stories, and archetypes that are going through those stories. John, I've enjoyed that this afternoon. It's been a great discussion. I thank you very much. I've got to now start to bring it to a close. So formally, thank you for such an enjoyable event. Ladies and gentlemen, the next talk in this series will be on the 16th of November, when John Ford Rescher will be speaking on Imagining Christianity, Robert Browning's Christmas Eve and Easter Day. And then he'll be in conversation with my co-convener of the series, Father Joseph Simmons, SJ, who is a research fellow at Campion Hall and does help me with the series, and I discuss all these events with him. Let me tell you also about two other Zoom events. On Friday, the 5th of November, we have the second event in our new series, China and the West, Cultural Dialogues. And Professor Terry Peach from Shanghai University of Finance and Economics will give a talk on Plato and Chunzi, on the construction of the ideal state, a meeting of distant minds. And I think here we're trying to bring two philosophers together from a Western tradition and from the Chinese tradition. I think it's going to be a terrific talk and an event in an important series that we've launched with Georgetown and again Blackfriars and Campion Hall, as well as the Society of Anglo Chinese Understanding in London. So please note that one on the 5th of November, it starts at 11 o'clock EST. But if you're listening in the UK, the event will start that week at 3 p.m. because the clocks will have gone back in the UK, but they won't have gone back in the US just for that week. So 3 p.m. on the 5th of November. On the 15th of November, we have an event teaming up with the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, when we will be joined by a distinguished panel to discuss truth and the rise of lies. 11 a.m. EST, 4 p.m. GMT. What a contemporary subject for us to look at, both in the United States and the UK at the moment, but elsewhere in the way in which the truth seems to be fluid, depending on what the politician or journalist might wish it to be. It's those kind of questions that we're going to be talking about. Thank you all who submitted questions. Also, I'd like, as ever, to thank those at Georgetown University who have made this happen, especially our administrators, Amy van der Villiers and Mary Gordon, who worked to make the Zoom presentations possible, and all those who helped them to do that. Special thanks, as ever, to Professor Catherine Temple at Georgetown University for feeding questions to me, and also for discussing various issues related to our events as we prepare them. In Oxford, I'd like to thank Dr. Nick Austin, SJ, who's Master of Campion Hall, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, Campion Hall administrators. At Blackfriars, thanks go to Dr. Richard Finn, OP, Director of the Las Casas Institute, Dr. John O'Connor, the Regent, and Kinga Rona Gabnai. At Georgetown, our thanks, of course, to Dr. Jack DeJoy, the President, and Dr. Tom Banshoff, the Vice President of Global Affairs, without whose support these events would not happen. I'd like to thank Maggie Scott for the work that she does behind the scenes to helping getting these things off the ground here in Oxford. Finally, my thanks to you in the audience for being part of that audience. Please join us again for some of these really exciting events that are coming up. Thanks again to John for a terrific afternoon. And now, in the meantime, take care, keep safe. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you and goodbye. Thanks, John. Bye-bye.